guys, welcome to another one of my brain fart series. So, as much as you want to accelerate hard, it's also important to be able to stop. So, let's talk about brakes on cars, on particularly modified cars where you have more power than what the stock brakes are equipped to handle. Until about, let's say, 6, 7 years, 8 years ago, the concept of big brake kit in India was absent completely. I mean, there was no car which came from the factory with fixed caliper other than the supercars, and you weren't able to buy calipers also. Buy big brake kits with fixed calipers on the aftermarket without breaking an arm and a leg. I think the first set of aftermarket brakes in India for modified cars was introduced by Peets back in the day, who bought over the Tarox brand, and they started with 4-piston, 6-piston calipers for the Volkswagen cars, which then became very popular. And now every tuner shop in India has the ability to source a good brake kit for you, or a cheap brake kit for you, or a mix of both. So I'm not going to go into good cheap brake kit versus expensive brake kit. That is a completely different story and a discussion for another times. But I'm going to talk particularly about the multi-piston brake calipers, which are fixed brake calipers. They don't slide around like your factory brake calipers do. So those calipers are what most of you guys who are upgrading to big brake kits are getting. Now, very nice setup. It's a very motorsport derived setup for the street, so it won't give you any issues. But what I've seen more and more is that people who are installing these brake calipers are not bleeding them properly, and they are essentially bleeding them in the wrong way, or they don't know how to bleed them, and that is causing these calipers to fail. And because of these, the lack of knowledge here in how to bleed multi-piston calipers, we're getting a lot of problems on the road. Some people are blowing their tires out, some are getting into accidents, some people suddenly, after installing their new 4 lakh, 3 lakh rupee big brake kit, have no brakes when they go out for a joyride with their friends. And it has happened to a couple of people I know. I know a lot of people who have issues, who have still not gotten their brake set up right. Now, why does this happen? And what is the problem here? So, normally, when you look at a brake caliper, each brake caliper has one bleeding screw from which you basically draw the fluid and bleed the air out. So 4 calipers, you have 4 bleeding screws. And whereas if you look at a fixed caliper, 99% of multi-piston fixed caliper setups which are part of big brake kits have 2 bleeding screws. One on the inside of the caliper, one on the outside of the caliper. So your calipers are basically sets of 2 like that. Your pistons over here, pistons over here. There's a bleeding screw on top over here and a bleeding screw on top over here. Now what most shops who are installing these calipers do is they only bleed the outside screw when they're bleeding the brakes, and they give you the car like that after it. Right? Now what happens in that case is you have one set of pistons on this side which have full fluid pressure, another set of pistons on the other side which don't have full fluid pressure because they have not been bled and they're full of air. So as a result, when you're taking the car initially, there's a lot of air resistance and you're like, oh wow, awesome brakes. But then once your brakes heat up, the brake fluid heats up, and then air which is sitting idle inside your caliper is heating up, you're gonna get brake fade and potentially most likely brake failure or complete dead pedal onto the ground. So, and that happens because the installers are not setting these up right, and they're not bleeding them right. So, take a note of this. So whenever you have a multi-piston, fixed caliper system, the ideal way to bleed them and this is true for every caliper which has more than one bleeding screw. Now in a multi-piston caliper setup, you will have one bleeding screw which is facing the outside of the caliper, which is towards the wheel, and one bleeding screw which is facing the inside of the caliper. Oh my god, idiots. The one bleeding screw which is facing the inside of the caliper, which is towards your wheel well. So the sequence that these brakes are meant to be bled is, you first bleed the outside screw which is facing the wheel. Bleed that one out, and then you close that, and then you open the inside one, the one which is facing the chassis. Bleed that one out, no air bubbles coming out. Close that, then you open the outside one again and bleed just a little bit. You'll see some air bubbles coming out, and then you close it. But that's how you set up, that's how you bleed these brakes. The problem is nobody else is doing that. I mean, most tuners are not doing that, most installation shops aren't doing that. They're just bleeding the outside brakes through and leaving it. Probably because they don't know, and they haven't done the research on how to set these up properly. But if you have a multi-piston braking system which has more than one bleeding screw, which is like most of them, the only multi-piston brakes which have only a single bleeding screw is, I think, the Brembo GT's, the Brembo's monoblock braking kit, which is not, I don't think anybody has it in India also. But all others have two bleeding screws, so you bleed the outside screw first, then you move to the inside screw, bleed out all the air from there, then you close that, then you move to the outside screw back again, and you bleed out all the air from there and close it. So you have to repeat that for each caliper that you have. So for example, most of you guys are just doing the front brake calipers because that's where the most of the braking effort goes. So that means you're gonna follow your car's regular bleeding sequence, right? Most cars, older cars, the bleeding sequence is you bleed the brake caliper which is farthest away from the ABS controller, and then you move it closer. So for example, in the Laura, which was a right-hand drive, front-wheel drive car, so the farthest away from the ABS controller was my rear right wheel. So I would do the rear right wheel first, then I'll do the rear left wheel, then I'll do the rear front right wheel, and the front left wheel. That's the sequence. Now in most modern cars with these modern ABSs, like this one for example, this car, the bleeding sequence is not that. So if you bleed this car the way I would in the sequence which I would have bled the Laura, I would have a very spongy pedal. So in this car the bleeding sequence has changed. So in this car is exactly the opposite. In this car they have, somehow Volkswagen has, the ABS controller can do it the other way around. So they do it the closest from, so it will be front left, front right, rear left, rear right. That's the bleeding sequence for this car, and all MQB cars, which also again most of the workshops don't know, they don't understand that. But anyway, so with that bleeding sequence, you have to bleed the front left brakes 3 times, out, in, out. Then you move to the front right brakes, you move it 3 times again, out, in, out, and then you do the rear brakes which are single bleeder, once each, and that's how you do it. So if you have a big brake kit and you feel your brakes aren't performing as they should, as you thought a big brake kit would, this is your problem. And go to your installer, go to whatever shop you are working with who installed your brakes or bleed your brakes, and have them follow this particular sequence for the calipers, and I can guarantee your brakes will feel 1,000 times better. Okay, so hope that helps. Take care guys, bye.